Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a highly strategic mathematical toolkit used by rational decision makers to navigate complex conflicts. As we explore game theory and how it applies to high-stakes negotiation, you're going to find that understanding the math behind human conflict is honestly an absolute game changer. We'll break down the fundamental points by looking at the core building block of these models, which is the effective unit of analysis, the rational, self-interested individual. Okay. Let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Welcome to game theory. 2. Cooperative versus non-cooperative. 3. Classic negotiation scenarios. 4. The value of time. And 5. Limitations of game theory.
Welcome to game theory. Let's lay out the scholarly foundation.
At its core, game theory is an analytical tool for explaining strategic decision-making. It deals with situations where your outcomes directly depend on the expected or actual choices of others. The foundational assumption here is that players are rational and seek to maximize their own utility. That individual player is our effective unit of analysis. Now, you don't need a math degree to actually use this. In fact, according to the Scotwork negotiation team, even toddlers, despite having zero professional negotiation experience, use basic game theory every single day to win the ultimate standoff, the Battle of Broccoli. They assess their parents' moves and strategize to maximize their utility, which, usually means getting dessert.
Now, what's really interesting about this sequential decision-making process is how it maps out the theoretical borders of formal behavior. Player Ann makes a choice, which dictates the exact node Bob lands on, and so forth. The visual style of a game tree isn't just a textbook graphic. It brings structure and authoritative weight to unpredictable human interaction, showing exactly how every single move restricts or expands the future options of everyone at the table.
Moving to Section 2, Cooperative versus Non-Cooperative Games, the fundamental divide.
The fundamental points of distinction here are really all about trust and enforcement. In cooperative games, players can form binding agreements. Think of a joint venture, or maybe a union negotiation where there's an actual framework to enforce collaboration. Here you're looking at concepts like the Shapley value, which is essentially a mathematical way to ensure everyone in a group gets a fair slice of the pie based exactly on how much value they brought to the table. On the other side, we have non-cooperative games. This is the cutthroat reality of acting independently in a market without enforceable trust. You can't make binding promises, so you are driven by pure, unadulterated self-interest.
And this brilliantly illustrates how non-cooperative games lock players into optimizing their own personal payoffs based strictly on what they anticipate the other player is going to do. This leads us directly to the famous Nash equilibrium, introduced by John Nash. It's a state where each player chooses a strategy that maximizes their own payoff given the strategies of the others. And crucially, no player has an incentive to unilaterally change their strategy. It's highly stable, for sure, but as we'll see, it's not always the optimal outcome for the group as a whole.
Section 3. Classic negotiation scenarios. Let's bring this into the real world.
All right, you've probably heard of this one, the legendary prisoner's dilemma. Two criminals are interrogated separately. If both stay silent, meaning they cooperate with each other, they each get just 1 year in jail. But look at the incentives. If player A informs while B stays silent, A walks free, getting 0 years, and B gets slapped with 3. Mutual mistrust usually pushes both parties to betray each other, lending them with 2 years each. In business, imagine two suppliers competing for a retailer. If one undercuts, they win it all. But if both undercut because of mistrust, prices completely collapse, and they both lose out on a highly profitable collaborative outcome.
But let me ask you this, what actually happens when you're at the negotiation table and absolutely neither side is willing to back down in a high-stakes standoff?
You get the game of chicken. Originating from that dangerous car racing game where two drivers speed towards each other, the one who swerves is the chicken. If neither swerves, they crash. In business, this is brinkmanship. Say two software firms claim rights to the exact same algorithm and both threaten legal action. Going to court is expensive and slow, that's the crash. But neither side wants to admit defeat. The only way to survive this without completely destroying value is if someone creatively reframes the offer. For instance, agreeing to a joint licensing deal to turn a massive legal risk into shared revenue.
So, the crucial point is that negotiation is heavily dictated by the specific game you find yourself in. In the stag hunt, you absolutely need joint commitment to take down the big prize. Otherwise, mistrust makes both parties default to safer, much smaller individual wins, like hunting a hare independently. In the trust game, someone has to take the first risk, like a vendor offering early access to premium software features, hoping for reciprocity. And then there's the ultimatum. One side sets fixed terms, take it or leave it. Scottwork faced this when a client demanded a 25% discount on a $40,000 corporate training course. Instead of just caving in or walking away, Scottwork creatively reframed it. They maintained their fixed fee but allowed the client to sell 6 open seats to their own suppliers at $4,000 each. The client got their $24,000 discount equivalent, and Scottwork kept their pricing integrity while gaining brand new leads. A real win-win.
Section 4. The value of time. Time as a literal bargaining chip.
Let's move to and see how this builds into what's known as the Rubenstein bargaining model. This beautifully captures the chronological aspect of strategy. Step 1 points out the first mover advantage. Generally speaking, the player who makes the first offer captures a much larger share of the surplus. But Step 2 introduces the discount factor. As time passes without an agreement, the cost of delay kicks in. The metaphorical pie spoils. Your future gains are worth less than immediate gains. Finally, Step 3 shows that as players become infinitely patient, the first mover advantage totally vanishes and the outcome converges to an equal split. Essentially, the very real threat of a shrinking pie is what forces rational players to eventually agree.
Finally, Section 5. Limitations of Game Theory. Time for a reality check.
As powerful as these models are, they do have some strict limitations. First, modeling complexity. Game theory completely oversimplifies real-world nuances. The math just assumes everyone has equal abilities and rigid preferences. Second, analysis paralysis. In dynamic situations, the computational effort required to find the absolute optimal decision can actually cost you more time and resources than it's worth. Third, and perhaps most importantly, irrationality. Remember our effective unit from the beginning, the perfectly rational, utility-maximizing individual? Well, actually, scratch that. Humans aren't always that. We are driven by emotions, cognitive biases, and a deep sense of social fairness. In a public goods game, people often contribute way more than their selfish, rational optimum would suggest, just out of a sense of duty. And finally, dynamic environments. These models often assume a static world, but in real business, the rules, the payoffs, and even the players at the table are constantly shifting.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Game theory is an absolutely incredible, structured lens for preparing for conflict. It charts the boundaries of rational play. But in a room full of unpredictable human emotions, fragile trust, and totally dynamic rules, how strictly should you rely on the math versus your own intuition? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I hope you take these strategies straight to your next high-stakes negotiation.